Harlem in the late 1930s was a place that breathed in rhythm and exhaled resilience. Every street seemed to hold a story. Every storefront carried the echoes of music, laughter, struggle, and quiet determination. The world outside often tried to define Harlem through stereotypes and suspicion, but those who lived within its brick-lined avenues understood something deeper. Harlem was not just a neighborhood, it was a community built on survival, pride, and the stubborn refusal to surrender dignity in the face of injustice. At night, the streets glowed with soft amber light from street lamps and club windows. Jazz drifted through the air like a heartbeat, the sound of trumpets and pianos floating across Lenox Avenue while crowds gathered in dim-lit clubs where musicians transformed hardship into melody. Inside those rooms, laughter and conversation filled the spaces between notes. For a few hours each night, the burdens of the outside world seemed to loosen their grip, but Harlem was also a place where tension lingered. Quietly beneath the music, powerful figures from outside the neighborhood had long viewed Harlem not as a living community, but as territory. Businesses were controlled, opportunities restricted, and too often the people who lived there were treated as if their voices mattered less than the profits others could take from their streets. In that environment, respect was not something freely given. It had to be earned carefully, protected patiently, and sometimes defended with quiet courage. Among the many faces that walked those streets, one man stood out not because he demanded attention, but because he never needed to. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, known to everyone simply as Bumpy Johnson, moved through Harlem with a presence that seemed both calm and immovable. He was not the loudest man in the room. He was not the one making grand speeches or dramatic gestures. Instead, his strength appeared in subtler ways: the steady way he listened when others spoke, the thoughtful pauses before he answered a question, the quiet dignity he carried even in situations where others might have responded with anger. People in Harlem trusted him, and trust in those days was something far more valuable than money or influence. It had not always been that way. Years earlier, Bumpy Johnson had arrived in Harlem as a young man carrying the weight of the world's harsh realities on his shoulders. Born in South Carolina during a time when opportunity for Black Americans was brutally limited, he grew up witnessing injustice so ordinary that many people stopped noticing it. But Bumpy noticed. He watched carefully, learned quickly, and developed a deep understanding of how power worked in a world that often denied fairness. When he eventually made his way north to Harlem, he discovered a place filled with ambition and creativity, but also vulnerability. Powerful outsiders attempted to control businesses and neighborhoods with little regard for the people living there. Many residents felt trapped between survival and submission. Bumpy saw something different. He saw a community that deserved protection over time. Through patience and intelligence rather than reckless force, he built relationships with shop owners, musicians, church leaders, and families. They respected him because he respected them first. He never spoke down to people. He never forgot where he came from, and most importantly, he never forgot what dignity looked like. Yet Harlem's fragile balance was not something everyone accepted. Across the city, in darker corners where ambition mixed with fear, powerful men watched Harlem closely. Among them was Ed Schultz, a figure whose name carried weight in the underworld of New York during the Prohibition era. Schultz had built a reputation for ruthlessness, for making decisions that others would not dare make. To many, he represented the kind of power that moved quickly and violently when challenged. But Dutch Schultz was also a man deeply suspicious of anything he could not control. And Harlem, with its growing sense of unity and independence, was something he could not easily dominate. Reports had begun reaching him about Bumpy Johnson. Not exaggerated rumors, not stories of chaos or confrontation, but something stranger. People spoke about the way Bumpy handled conflict without raising his voice. They described situations where tensions that should have erupted into violence instead dissolved into silence because of a few carefully chosen words. To men like Schultz, that kind of influence was unsettling. He believed power should be loud, visible, and unquestioned. Bumpy Johnson represented the opposite. Quiet authority, earned respect, and the loyalty of a community that refused to be intimidated. In Schultz's mind, that made Bumpy dangerous. One cold evening in Manhattan, inside a dimly lit office above a noisy street, Schultz listened as one of his associates described the growing respect Bumpy commanded in Harlem. "He doesn't shout," the man said carefully. "Doesn't threaten, but people listen when he speaks." Schultz leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as though trying to solve a puzzle. "People listen. Why?" he asked. The associate hesitated before answering. "Because he listens first." For several seconds, the room remained silent. Then Schultz chuckled softly, though the sound carried no humor. "Everyone listens," he said slowly. "Eventually." But in his mind, the question lingered. What kind of man could hold a neighborhood's respect without fear? That question would soon lead to a test. Meanwhile in Harlem, Bumpy Johnson sat quietly at a small table inside a modest restaurant on 135th Street. The place was not glamorous. It had simple wooden chairs, warm lighting, and the smell of fresh food drifting from the kitchen. It was the kind of place where neighbors gathered to talk about everyday life, business, family, music, church, and the countless small struggles that filled their days. Several men sat with Bumpy that evening, discussing concerns about businesses along Lenox Avenue. Some owners worried about outside groups attempting to pressure them into unfavorable deals. Others spoke about protecting local workers and keeping money circulating within the neighborhood. Bumpy listened carefully, his hands folded calmly on the table. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the steady confidence that made people lean forward to hear him. "Respect," he said quietly, "is the only thing nobody can take from you unless you hand it away." The men nodded. They knew exactly what he meant. Harlem had spent too many years being told what it was worth by people who had never walked its streets with love or understanding. Bumpy believed that had to change, but change rarely comes without resistance. Across the city, plans were beginning to form, plans driven not by justice or understanding, but by fear of losing control. And soon, that fear would arrive in Harlem. Not with conversation, but with confrontation. Yet, what those men did not understand was something Harlem had already begun to learn. Bumpy Johnson did not fight for respect. He made others realize they should have offered it from the beginning. And sometimes, that realization could be far more powerful than any weapon. Winter arrived in Harlem, slowly, like a quiet visitor stepping carefully across familiar ground. The streets were colder now, the wind weaving through narrow avenues and curling around the corners of brick buildings that had stood long enough to witness generations of struggle and hope. Yet even as the air sharpened, the neighborhood itself remained alive with energy. Music still drifted from jazz clubs, laughter still rose from crowded restaurants, and conversation still carried the determined rhythm of people who refused to let hardship define them. But beneath the warmth of community, something else had begun to move quietly through the city. Whispers, not loud enough to cause panic, but persistent enough to travel from barbershops to storefronts, from musicians backstage to businessmen counting their receipts at night. People had begun hearing the same rumor repeated in slightly different ways. Some said powerful men outside Harlem had grown uneasy. Others claimed that certain figures believed Harlem's independence had gone too far. And at the center of those rumors, always spoken with careful respect, was one name: Bumpy Johnson. Inside Harlem, his reputation had continued to grow since the events that people still talked about in hushed tones from weeks earlier. Those who had witnessed that moment, when dignity had quietly overcome humiliation, still struggled to explain exactly what they had felt. It was not the excitement of confrontation or the thrill of victory. It was something deeper. A reminder that strength did not always arrive with noise. But outside Harlem, the story sounded very different. Across the river, in rooms where smoke curled slowly toward dark ceilings and conversations were measured in cautious whispers, powerful men listened carefully as news of Bumpy Johnson's growing influence reached them. For some, it was simply another story in a city full of shifting alliances. For others, it felt like the beginning of something they could not fully control. Among those men sat Dutch Schultz. He had built his reputation during one of the most chaotic periods in American history, when Prohibition had turned ordinary commerce into a battlefield of ambition and greed. Schultz was a man who believed power belonged to whoever was willing to seize it without hesitation. His world rewarded decisiveness, and hesitation often meant defeat. But Bumpy Johnson confused him. The reports Schultz heard did not describe a man chasing power or demanding obedience. Instead, they described someone who carried influence like a quiet current beneath the surface of Harlem itself. Business owners trusted him. Families respected him. Even people who disagreed with him rarely spoke about him with anger. For a man like Schultz, that kind of loyalty seemed almost unnatural. One evening in a dim office above a busy Manhattan street, Schultz listened impatiently as one of his associates finished explaining how Harlem had responded to recent events. "They don't fear him," the associate said carefully. Schultz leaned forward slightly. "Then why do they listen?" The man hesitated before answering. "Because he listens to them." The room fell silent. Schultz stared at the desk in front of him for several seconds, his fingers tapping slowly against the wood. To most people, the explanation would have sounded simple. But to Schultz, it represented something troubling. Fear, he understood. Loyalty built on intimidation made sense to him. Respect built on dignity did not. Finally he spoke again, his voice softer now but far more dangerous. "Every man has a breaking point." No one in the room responded. They knew what that sentence meant. And somewhere in the quiet corners of that conversation, a decision was made. Not a loud declaration. Not an official plan written on paper. Just an understanding that someone needed to test the man Harlem respected so deeply. If Bumpy Johnson's reputation truly rested on calm dignity, then someone would push him until that calm disappeared. That task would fall to a man who had spent most of his life doing difficult things without asking why. He was known simply as Victor. Victor was not the kind of man people noticed immediately. His strength did not come from dramatic gestures or loud threats. Instead, he carried himself with a quiet efficiency that made others uneasy even before they understood why. He rarely spoke more than necessary, and when he did, his words were as direct as the work he was known for completing. Victor believed the world worked according to one simple truth: every man could be broken. He accepted the assignment without hesitation. For him, it was not personal. It was simply another task. 2 nights later, Harlem was alive as usual. The winter air was cold enough to make people walk quickly between destinations, but the streets still pulsed with life. Outside clubs, groups of people gathered beneath glowing signs while music spilled into the night. Taxi horns echoed down avenues, and the smell of roasted food drifted through the air from small restaurants where families shared late meals. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. But Victor noticed everything. He walked slowly down Lenox Avenue, his coat collar turned up against the wind as his eyes moved carefully across the neighborhood. He studied the rhythm of the street, the conversations, the laughter, the steady flow of people moving between businesses. What surprised him most was the atmosphere. He had expected tension. Instead, he felt something else: pride. Harlem was not afraid. Eventually, Victor stopped outside a small restaurant that several people had mentioned during quiet conversations earlier that evening. It was a modest place, warmly lit, with windows slightly fogged from the heat inside. And inside sat Bumpy Johnson. Victor paused for a moment before stepping toward the door. Inside the restaurant, The atmosphere was relaxed. A few tables were filled with neighborhood regulars enjoying late dinners, while a quiet conversation unfolded at a corner table where Bumpy sat with 3 other men. They were discussing community matters, the kind of conversations that filled Harlem's evenings, when people gathered to solve problems together. Bumpy listened carefully as one man described concerns about a local shop owner who had been pressured by outsiders trying to take control of his business. When the man finished speaking, Bumpy nodded thoughtfully. "Fear grows fastest where respect disappears," he said calmly. The others around the table nodded. But before the conversation could continue, the restaurant door opened. The cold air that followed carried something heavier than winter. Victor stepped inside. At first, few people noticed him. He looked like any other man seeking a warm meal on a cold night. But those who studied faces carefully sensed something different about the way he moved through the room, purpose. Victor walked directly toward Bumpy's table. As he approached, several conversations around the restaurant slowly faded into silence. It was not fear that caused the quiet, it was instinct. People recognized when something important was about to happen. Victor stopped beside the table. For a moment, neither man spoke. Bumpy slowly lifted his eyes from the table and looked at the stranger standing before him. His expression remained calm, thoughtful, almost curious. Victor expected tension. Instead, he found himself looking into the steady gaze of a man who seemed entirely untroubled by his presence. Bumpy gestured gently toward an empty chair. "Cold night," he said quietly. "You should sit." The offer caught Victor slightly off guard. This was not how confrontations usually began. Still, he remained standing. "I didn't come to sit," Victor replied. Bumpy studied him for a moment longer before nodding slowly. "I thought maybe not." Around them, the restaurant had grown completely silent. Victor felt the attention of every person in the room, yet his focus remained on the man seated calmly before him. "You're Bumpy Johnson," Victor said. It was not a question. Bumpy nodded once. "And you came a long way tonight," Bumpy replied gently. "Which means someone sent you." Victor's jaw tightened slightly. "Does it matter who?" Bumpy leaned back in his chair, considering the question carefully. "No," he said after a moment. "What matters is why you believe they were right." Victor had prepared himself for threats. He had expected defiance. Instead, he felt something far more unsettling: conversation. "You don't understand," Victor said quietly. Bumpy's voice remained calm. "Then help me understand." For several seconds, Victor said nothing. The silence stretched across the room like a held breath. Finally, he spoke again. "People say you changed things here." Bumpy shook his head gently. "No," he said. "Harlem changed itself. I just remind people what they're worth." Victor studied him carefully. He had spent years reading people watching for fear, arrogance, weakness. But Bumpy Johnson displayed none of those things, only patience. "You think words can stop men who use violence?" Victor asked. Bumpy looked around the restaurant briefly, as if considering the lives sitting quietly in the room. Then he returned his gaze to Victor. "Violence doesn't scare people who've already survived injustice," he said softly. The words hung in the air. Victor felt something unexpected stirring in his thoughts. Doubt. Not doubt about his ability to complete the task he had been sent to do. Doubt about whether the task itself made sense. He had expected a man defending his reputation. Instead, he found a man defending dignity. For the first time since entering the restaurant, Victor hesitated. Bumpy noticed. And then, in a voice so calm it almost sounded like a father speaking to a troubled son, he said something that would later be repeated across Harlem for years. "You walked in here believing you carried power," Bumpy said quietly. Victor said nothing. Bumpy continued. "But power doesn't belong to the man who threatens a room." He paused, his eyes steady. "It belongs to the man who leaves the room better than he found it." The restaurant remained silent. Victor looked around slowly, noticing the faces, watching him not with fear, but with quiet hope. And for the first time in many years, he realized something he had never allowed himself to consider. Not every battle needed to be fought. After a long moment, Victor stepped back from the table. His shoulders relaxed slightly, as though a weight he had carried for years had suddenly shifted. Without another word, he turned toward the door. The cold night air rushed inside as he stepped back onto the street. Behind him, Harlem remained exactly as it had been before he arrived, alive, proud, and unbroken. Inside the restaurant, the silence lingered for several seconds before conversations slowly returned. But everyone in the room understood something important had just happened. The man who had come to test Harlem's strength had discovered something he had not expected: respect. And sometimes respect can stop a storm before it ever begins. Story of that winter night in Harlem did not spread with shouting or celebration. It moved quietly, the way meaningful stories often do, passing from one conversation to another in low voices that carried both disbelief and pride. Some people heard it in barbershops while the hum of clippers filled the room. Others heard it in the back corners of jazz clubs where musicians rested between sets. A few heard it from restaurant owners who had been present when the stranger walked in, and later left without completing the task he had come to do. No one told the story exactly the same way. Some said the man who came into the restaurant had looked like trouble from the moment he stepped through the door. Others said the room had fallen silent the moment Bumpy Johnson looked up at him, as if the entire neighborhood somehow sensed that something important was about to happen. A few insisted the stranger had come with violence in his mind, but left carrying something far heavier. But every version ended with the same quiet conclusion. The man walked away, and Harlem remained standing. For many residents, the moment felt like confirmation of something they had already believed about Bumpy Johnson. It wasn't that he was fearless or untouchable. Those who knew him best understood he was simply a man who refused to let anger make decisions for him. He had learned long ago that dignity carried a kind of strength that force alone could never create. But outside Harlem, the story sounded very different. Across the river in Manhattan, the news arrived like an unfinished sentence. The man who had been sent to confront Bumpy Johnson had returned without violence, without chaos, without the proof Dutch Schultz believed he would bring back. When Schultz first heard the report, he did not react immediately. He sat quietly in his office, listening as one of his associates carefully explained what witnesses in Harlem were saying. He walked in, the man said, spoke with Johnson, then left. Schultz's eyes narrowed slightly. That's it? The associate nodded. No fight, no trouble. For several seconds, the only sound in the room was the faint noise of traffic outside the building. Schultz leaned back slowly in his chair, his fingers resting against his chin as though studying a complicated puzzle. In his world, events followed simple patterns. Confrontation created fear. Fear created submission. Submission created control. But Harlem had not followed the pattern. Did he say why? Schultz asked quietly. The associate shook his head. No. Schultz stared toward the window for a long time after the man finished speaking. He had spent years building power through decisions that forced people to choose between obedience and consequences. That system had worked for him because most men responded predictably when pressure increased. But Bumpy Johnson seemed to operate differently. Instead of escalating tension, he absorbed it. Instead of answering hostility with hostility, he responded with calm, and somehow that calm had stopped the confrontation before it began. For a man like Schultz, the idea was deeply unsettling. Because if fear did not control Harlem, then something else did. Respect, and respect could not be seized the same way power could. Meanwhile in Harlem, Bumpy Johnson continued his days the way he always had. He visited businesses, spoke with community leaders, and spent long evenings discussing neighborhood concerns with the people who trusted him most. Those conversations rarely involved grand strategies or dramatic plans. More often they revolved around small but important matters, helping a struggling shop owner stay open, ensuring local musicians were treated fairly, supporting families facing difficult times. Bumpy believed real strength grew from those quiet responsibilities. He never mentioned the confrontation at the restaurant. When people asked about it, he simply smiled and changed the subject. Because to him, the moment had not been a victory. It had been a reminder. A reminder that people were always capable of choosing a different path when someone offered them the chance to do so. But far beyond Harlem's streets, that quiet philosophy was beginning to cause concern. In the weeks that followed, several businessmen and influential figures who operated throughout New York began hearing the same reports Schultz had heard. They learned that Harlem was not responding to pressure the way it once had. Shop owners spoke with greater confidence. Community leaders refused deals that felt unfair. And through it all, Bumpy Johnson's name continued to surface in conversations about the neighborhood's growing unity. For some powerful men, this seemed like a small problem. For others, it looked like the beginning of something far larger. Eventually, the situation reached a point where Schultz decided he needed to see the man himself, not through stories, not through intermediaries, but directly. The idea surprised many of the men who worked with him. Schultz rarely traveled into Harlem personally. It was not considered territory where he felt comfortable appearing without careful planning. But this time he insisted. Some puzzles, Schultz said quietly one afternoon, can only be solved face to face. And so, on a cold evening several weeks after the night Victor walked away from the restaurant, a black car rolled slowly down a Harlem street where the glow of jazz clubs and storefronts illuminated the winter darkness. Inside the car sat Dutch Schultz. He watched the neighborhood carefully as the driver guided the vehicle toward Lenox Avenue. The scene outside the window looked very different from the stories many outsiders believed about Harlem. There was no chaos, no visible fear, no sign of the weakness some powerful figures expected to find. Instead, he saw life. Families walking together, couples laughing outside music halls, musicians carrying instruments through narrow doorways. It was not the environment he had imagined. Eventually, the car stopped near a modest cafe where Bumpy Johnson was known to meet with friends in the evenings. Schultz stepped out slowly. The cold air touched his face as he looked around the street, noticing the curious glances from people who recognized him. His presence in Harlem was unusual enough to attract attention, but no one approached him. People simply watched. Inside the cafe, Bumpy Johnson sat at a small table near the window. He had already been informed that a visitor had arrived in the neighborhood. Harlem had a way of sharing information quickly when something unusual occurred. Still, he did not move when the door opened. He simply lifted his eyes as Dutch Schultz entered the room. For a moment, the cafe became completely silent. The two men studied each other from across the room. They represented different philosophies, different approaches to power, different ways of understanding the world. Yet in that moment, they also shared something unexpected: curiosity. Schultz walked slowly toward the table and stopped across from Bumpy. Without speaking, Bumpy gestured toward the empty chair. Schultz sat. Neither man spoke for several seconds. Finally, Schultz leaned back slightly and studied Bumpy with a thoughtful expression. "I sent someone to see you," he said. Bumpy nodded calmly. "Yes." Schultz tilted his head. "He didn't do what he was supposed to do." Bumpy's voice remained gentle. "No." Schultz tapped the table with one finger. "Why?" Bumpy considered the question carefully. Then he answered in the same quiet tone that had unsettled Victor. Weeks earlier, because he realized something. Schultz waited. "That violence doesn't make a man powerful," Bumpy said. The words hung between them. Schultz looked around the cafe. noticing the people pretending not to listen while clearly hearing every word. "You expect me to believe that?" he asked. Bumpy met his gaze steadily. "No," he replied softly. "I expect you to understand it." For a moment Schultz said nothing. He had entered Harlem believing this meeting would confirm his suspicions about Bumpy Johnson, that the man's reputation was exaggerated, that his calm demeanor was simply another strategy. Instead he felt something far more complicated: respect. Not admiration, but respect for a man who clearly believed in the words he spoke. Schultz leaned forward slightly. "You think this neighborhood belongs to you?" Bumpy shook his head. "Harlem belongs to the people who live here." Schultz watched him carefully. "And you speak for them?" Bumpy's answer came without hesitation. "No." He paused. "I listen to them." The cafe remained silent. Schultz studied the man across from him for a long moment before slowly standing. He looked around the room again, noticing the quiet confidence in the faces watching the conversation. Then he spoke one final sentence before turning toward the door. "You're an unusual man, Mr. Johnson." Bumpy nodded politely. "No," he said softly. "I'm just a patient one." Schultz left the cafe without another word. Outside, Harlem continued moving as it always had. But those who witnessed the conversation that night understood something significant had happened. Two powerful men had met, and neither had raised his voice. Yet somehow the balance of respect in Harlem had grown stronger than before. Because sometimes the most powerful moments in history are not the ones filled with noise. They are the ones filled with silence. The meeting between Bumpy Johnson and Dutch Schultz did not end with shouting, threats, or the kind of explosive drama people often expected when powerful men crossed paths in New York during that era. Instead, it ended with something far stranger: silence. But silence has a way of traveling through a city faster than chaos ever could. Within days, the story had spread across Harlem, not as gossip, but as something closer to quiet pride. People repeated the same detail over and over again. Dutch Schultz had come into Harlem himself, sat across from Bumpy Johnson, spoken directly to him, and then left without a single threat, without a raised voice, without the kind of confrontation that many had feared might erupt. For a neighborhood that had spent decades being told it had little power, the moment felt deeply symbolic. Because for the first time in a long time, Harlem had not been treated like territory. It had been treated like a place with a voice. And that voice belonged to its people. Yet the story did not simply disappear after that meeting. In fact, the quiet tension surrounding Harlem only deepened in the weeks that followed. Powerful men across the city watched closely, trying to understand exactly what had happened inside that cafe. Some believed Schultz had simply chosen patience. Others suspected something more complicated. Because when a man known for intimidation leaves a conversation quietly, people begin asking questions. One evening, in a smoky office overlooking the crowded streets of Manhattan, Schultz sat with several of his closest associates while they discussed the situation. The men around the table were used to clear instructions and decisive action. But tonight their leader seemed unusually thoughtful. One of them finally spoke. "Are we leaving Harlem alone now?" Schultz did not answer immediately. Instead, he stared out the window, watching the city lights flicker across wet pavement. "Below, do you know what I saw in that cafe?" he asked quietly. The men shook their heads. "Confidence," Schultz continued. "Not the kind people fake when they're trying to look brave. Real confidence." Another man leaned forward slightly. "You think he's dangerous?" Schultz smiled faintly. "No," he said. Then his voice grew quieter. "I think he's something worse." The men exchanged confused looks. "Someone people believe in." For men like Schultz, belief was a force that could not easily be controlled. Fear could be managed. Deals could be negotiated. But belief, real belief, belonged to communities, not individuals. And Harlem believed in Bumpy Johnson. That realization forced Schultz to make a decision he rarely made. He chose not to push further. Not because he feared Bumpy, but because he recognized something important. Harlem's loyalty to that man could not be broken by pressure alone. Attempting to force the issue might create conflict that benefited no one. For the first time in years, Schultz decided to step back. But Harlem did not know that yet. In the days following the cafe meeting, many residents quietly prepared themselves for the possibility that retaliation might come. Shop owners watched the streets more carefully. Musicians finishing late-night performances walked home together, rather than alone. Families whispered cautious prayers before closing their doors at night. They knew power rarely retreated peacefully, yet Bumpy Johnson remained calm. Each morning, he continued his usual routine, greeting people on the streets, checking on local businesses, and spending time speaking with community leaders about the future of Harlem. If he felt any concern about the situation, he never showed it. One afternoon, while walking along 135th Street, a young man approached him hesitantly. "Mr. Johnson," the man said, "people are worried." Bumpy looked at him kindly. "About what?" The young man glanced around nervously before answering. "They think trouble might be coming." Bumpy studied the street for a moment, the storefronts, the passing pedestrians, the children laughing as they chased each other near the corner. Then he spoke softly. "Fear is loud," he said, "but respect is patient." The young man frowned slightly. "I don't understand." Bumpy placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "People who truly respect a community don't try to destroy it," he said. Those words traveled through Harlem in the days that followed, repeated in conversations between neighbors and friends. And slowly, something remarkable began to happen. The tension faded. No new threats appeared. No outsiders attempted to pressure businesses. The storm everyone had expected simply never arrived. At first, people remained cautious, waiting for signs that the calm might break. But as weeks passed without trouble, the mood in Harlem gradually shifted from anxiety to something much stronger: relief and pride. Because Harlem had stood firm without violence, without chaos, without surrendering its dignity. Meanwhile, far from the neighborhood streets where that change was being felt, Schultz continued observing the situation quietly. Reports reached him regularly describing Harlem's steady stability. Businesses remained open. Music continued filling the night. And Bumpy Johnson continued walking those streets with the same calm authority he had always carried. One evening, Schultz sat alone in his office reviewing those reports when a thought occurred to him, one he had never expected to have. Perhaps Harlem did not need controlling. Perhaps it simply needed respect. The idea surprised him enough that he laughed softly to himself. It was not a thought the younger version of him would have accepted easily. But the meeting with Bumpy Johnson had left an impression he could not ignore. Weeks later, an associate asked him again about Harlem. Schultz answered simply, "Let them be." Those 3 words quietly ended a conflict that many people had feared would escalate into something far worse. Back in Harlem, the effects of that decision were not immediately visible. Life simply continued the way it always had. Music played in crowded clubs. Restaurants filled with conversation late into the night. Children ran through the streets during warm afternoons while families watched from stoops. But beneath the ordinary rhythm of daily life, something important had changed. People walked a little taller. They spoke with a little more confidence, because they knew their community had faced pressure without breaking. One evening months later, Bumpy Johnson returned to the same restaurant where the stranger named Victor had once stood before him with violence in his mind. The room looked almost exactly the same as it had that night. Warm lights, familiar faces, the comforting smell of food drifting from the kitchen. As Bumpy sat at his usual table, the owner approached him with a quiet smile. "You remember that night?" the man asked. Bumpy nodded. "Yes." The owner leaned closer. "I think about it sometimes," he said. "How everything could have gone differently." Bumpy considered the thought carefully. "Yes," he replied. "Most things can." The owner studied him for a moment. "You weren't afraid?" Bumpy smiled gently. "Everyone feels fear," he said. Then he added something the man would remember for the rest of his life. "But fear doesn't decide who we are. Our choices do." The owner nodded slowly, before returning to the counter. Around the room, conversations continued and laughter filled the air, just as it had on countless other nights in Harlem. But those who understood the deeper story knew something important had been proven. Not through violence, not through intimidation, through dignity. Because the man Harlem respected most had shown them something powerful. Real strength does not come from forcing others to bow. It comes from standing tall without needing anyone else to fall, and that kind of power cannot be taken. It can only be earned.